There's nearly 1,200 extant letters, and many of them really do read as conversations. And I think through it all is just this deep and abiding respect and love for one another. And no matter what you think you know about John Adams and Abigail Smith Adams, I promise you, if you read some of their letters, you're going to learn something new.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event. And today we're going to learn about New England's ageless love story about John and Abigail Adams with historian Sara Martin. I'm Haley Lerner, GBH Associate Producer for Arts and Culture, and I'm thrilled to be here today. Thanks to everyone that joined us today, including our Champion Circle and Beacon Circle members. We appreciate your continued generous support. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you to our partner, Massachusetts Historical Society. Sara Martin, the editor-in-chief of the Adams paper at the Massachusetts Historical Society, is here to discuss this swoon-worthy love story. Since it was established in 1954, the Adams paper has published letterpress volumes of the diaries, letters, and other writings of the Adams family of Massachusetts. Recently, they published 2 letterpress series, Adams Family Correspondence and the Papers of John Adams, and 2 digital editions, the Adams Paper Digital Edition and the John Quincy Adams Digital Diary. Sara participates in a number of outreach activities at the MHS, including educational workshops and public lectures on the Adams family and the craft of historical editing. Her previous experience in public history includes partnerships with archaeologists and cultural heritage managers and work with local historical societies and community groups on public engagement projects and in-house exhibit development. Sara, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be with the GBH audience today. I can't wait to dive into something that I dearly love, Abigail and John's correspondence. And I thought I would begin by sharing just a few brief slides to let the audience know a little more about what we do at the MHS, and also to show off a few of the great collection items related to Abigail Smith Adams and John Adams. Thank you so much. So the Massachusetts Historical Society is an independent library and archive. We are free and open to the public, and we have more than 14 million items in our collection. I encourage everyone to visit our website, www.masshist.org, to learn more about our collections, to take a spin through the amazing digital resources we have online, and also to learn more about our public programs. I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Adams Papers editorial project at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where our whole reason for being is to transcribe, contextualize, and publish the collected writings of the Adams family. Our work is based on a core multi-generational archive of more than 250,000 manuscript pages, and these are the papers that the family collected and preserved and then donated to the society. This archive spans a 150-year chronology, roughly from about 1750 to 1900, and includes a huge swath of milestone events in American history, many of which the Adamses either witnessed or participated in. But kind of stitching all of that together is this really wonderful information that sheds incredible insights on the social and cultural evolution of American society across the same period. It is really a wonderful archive to research and to work with. Today, we print the Adamses' writings in both letterpress and digital formats across 3 series: diaries, the general correspondence of the general correspondence and other papers of the Adams statesmen, and the Adams Family Correspondence, which is where you'll find the correspondence between John and Abigail Adams. I'll tell you, just feel like they need no introduction, but I included a slide with some great images. Abigail Smith was born in Weymouth. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Quincy and the town's Congregationalist minister, Reverend William Smith. She was a self-proclaimed lover of literature, but received no formal education. Instead, she learned to read and write at home. And that is something that she comes back to again and again over the course of her life and in her letters. John Adams was 9 years her senior. He was the son of Susanna Boylston and Deacon John Adams, who was a shoemaker and a farmer in Braintree. John graduated from Harvard in 1755 and went on to study law and settle in Braintree, in the home that is facing the screen in the middle, the slightly orange-colored one, which is where John and Abigail set up housekeeping after they got married. The couple met in 1759. Abigail is 14 years old, John is 23. It didn't go very well, but 2 years later, the two were courting, and they eventually marry in October 1764. Their marriage spans more than 50 years, and fortunate for the historian and people who are interested in this time period, they spent a whole lot of time apart. And the way they maintain their relationship and their love is through letters and letter writing. And in fact, we have about 1,200 letters still extant between the two. And I'm going to show you and tell you just about two quickly. This is the first. So the first of the first, essentially. And this is from John Adams to Abigail in October 1762 to his Miss Adorable, where he is basically saying that she is in his debt. And he writes, "I hereby order you to give him as many kisses and as many hours of your company after 9 o'clock as he shall request," because he had given her 2 or 3 million kisses at least to every one that she had returned. It's very playful. It's a great way to start this correspondence. And then we get something that is less playful, but certainly maintains a deep and abiding love that they had over the 40 years that they wrote letters to each other. And I think it's appropriate that Abigail gets the final word in the correspondence. And so here we have in the next slide, the final letter written between the two that we have extant. And this dates to February 1801. Abigail is writing from Philadelphia as she is on her way home to Quincy after being in Washington, D.C. John Adams has lost the presidential election to Thomas Jefferson, and so she has headed home early to kind of get them started on their retirement. And she is very excited to kind of end her public life and to begin kind of a quieter period, which lasted 17 years, at home. And so this is a really wonderful letter. And what we have is Abigail's in Philadelphia, where they've lived for a number of years, and someone has published her arrival in the paper. She writes of her surprise and that the next morning by 10 o'clock, despite the fact that it was rainy, they began to come and have continued to come by throngs ever since. Right. And so all of Philadelphia is really turning out to pay their respects to Abigail and to wish her well as she exits public life. And so she kind of puzzles on this for a minute. And then, as she so frequently does, she turns kind of more personal and says, "Adieu, my dear friend. I wish you well through the remainder of your political journey. I want to see the list of judges," right? She always still stays tuned into politics. And of course, here she's referencing the many judicial nominations that John Adams submitted to the Senate in the final weeks of his presidency. And so this is just a quick snapshot of the bookends of the correspondence. And now I can't wait to find out what interests you and what answers I can provide the audience.
Yeah, to start, can you tell us a little bit more about how this love story between John and Abigail began? I know we saw that first letter, but what was the beginning of their relationship and their correspondence like?
Yes, so the beginning of the relationship was a bit rough. I mentioned that they met in 1759, and we only actually have John's record of that meeting. He wrote about it in his diary, but his good friend Richard Cranch was courting Abigail's older sister, Mary. And so John and Richard went to the Weymouth parsonage basically to pay their respects to Mary. And there, John Adams met Abigail and all of her sisters. There were 3 Smith daughters. And so Abigail's 14 years old, and he wasn't overly impressed with really any members of the family. He sort of criticized her father and then called Abigail a wit and said she was not fond and not frank. And it wasn't a positive experience, shall we say. But then we next kind of tap into the relationship again at the end of 1761, where John Adams is actually writing to Mary Smith Cranch, Abigail's sister, and he has this kind of reference to Abigail saying, give her my respects. And he references George III, who has just been crowned king, and basically says that he will foment a rebellion if her affections have kind of shifted to the young king. And so we know by then that they're sort of committed to each other. And then it's almost another year before we get that first courtship letter. And in all, there are 35 courtship letters between the 2 of them in that 2-year period. And most of them are written by John. It's about a 1/3, 2/3 split. And John is certainly the more effusive letter writer in terms of being emotional. Abigail plays it a little closer to the vest, which is pretty typical of kind of their personalities and characters over time.
And how typical was their letter writing relationship as compared to other people at this time? Was it prolific, or, was this the typical way of communicating for people at this time when they're apart?
So it's definitely the typical way of communicating for kind of middling and elite people in the colonies, anywhere really. This is how you maintain ties. I think the one of the key differences with Abigail and John is they spent so very much time apart, right? So even before John enters public service, he's a lawyer, which means he's traveling a circuit and he is away from home. And so they're writing while he's out as a circuit, writing the circuit. And then once he enters public service, as kind of the events of the revolution start to unfold, and he's at the Continental Congress, he's away for months at a time in Philadelphia while Abigail is in Braintree and Boston caring for their young family. And then, of course, one of John Adams's main contributions to the revolutionary effort is that he represented the United States in Europe. And so he spends almost 10 years abroad, kind of negotiating recognition of the United States and negotiating the peace treaty. And for most of that, at least most of the early part of that, they are separated. Abigail does end up in Europe, and they spend about 4 years together in Europe, but they had been separated for a continuous stretch of about 5 years before that and another 18 months. So, I mean, they were just separated for so long. And again, it's why we have such an amazing record and we know so much about them, is because they left these great letters.
And so I know one thing that's really evident in these letters is how they really had such an equal partnership. Can you talk a little bit about that, of how they kind of had this really, she was really on the level with him, involved in politics. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So I think you see that in many aspects of their lives. And it's certainly something that evolves, right? As any relationship does, it changes over time. And so she is much more hesitant early, both kind of in her intellectual development, as he is increasingly gone. The management, not just of their home, but also of their property, is left to Abigail. And so she is more tentative early. And then as she is increasingly kind of empowered to make decisions on her own, you kind of see the confidence build over the years. But I think, she is this self-proclaimed lover of literature. She definitely felt she felt the lack of a formal education. It's something she complains about kind of repeatedly. But she was highly intelligent and deeply interested in the acquisition of knowledge, and also had a circle of friends and mentors, which included both John Adams and her brother-in-law, Richard Cranch, who encouraged her to kind of build that knowledge. I mean, John sort of pokes fun at her during their courtship to say, she had written him to say, tell me all my faults. And he is very tongue-in-cheek, and he's like, well, you can't sing, and you kind of hunch over, and he's like, and that's because you read and you write and you do all these things that a lady shouldn't. But really that was a big draw for him, is that Abigail's intellect really stands up to John's intelligence. And so I think they're really compatible in that way. And she is deeply interested, not only in the causes in which he is participating, but she is interested in politics and has her own opinions and is privy to not just the kind of information that is available in the papers and through their network of correspondence, but there are times where she is very much in the know of the inner circles of kind of US politics, and has very decided opinions about
And
it.
so at this time, I'm encouraging everyone to, if you have any questions, please send them in the Q&A tab. I'm going to start going from there and answering those questions. And if you see a question that you would like to really have answered, please give it an upvote. To start, Robert Wong asked, what political or historical event did Abigail have the most influence on her husband to make a decision about?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say it is probably during the presidency, because while Abigail is always a trusted advisor and she's always a sounding board for John throughout his public life, when they are together during the presidential years, especially as John Adams's presidency becomes a bit more embattled, right? Like, I mean, he's getting attacked in the press, and the Federalist Party is splintering, and we've got major diplomatic crisis with France. And so he's kind of just being battered on all sides. His kind of network of trusted, trying to think of the word, like confidants, really narrows. And Abigail is, I think, prime among those people. And certainly there are times where they are talking and she is influencing his actions. She writes about it a whole bunch of patriotic addresses come into John Adams when he's president, and he chooses to reply to almost all of them. And she writes her sister has sort of complained about what happened in one of them, the language in one of them, and she says, I got him to change it a little bit, but I sort of share that too. She is both people who are seeking John Adams's patronage for various government posts are writing to Abigail, and Abigail is at times replying on his behalf. She also works to kind of change the narrative in the press, what we would now call like combating fake news. So she is sending information through her networks of correspondence to say, hey, here's really what's going on, and asking people at times to get that information inserted in the newspapers, as a way of kind of defending John Adams's and the Federalist viewpoint.
And so another question, kind of a bit about Abigail's influence. Josh Reardon asked, I have heard some of the animosity between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson after he lost the election was due to Abigail. Any comment?
So Abigail was less forgiving of Thomas Jefferson's politics than John Adams ultimately was. There's this wonderful exchange that Abigail writes to her son Thomas of basically the last time that she interacted with Jefferson in Philadelphia. And they were at dinner and they had conversation, and it really came down to them discussing politics and how they differed in politics, and it's all very veiled and coded. But she left with kind of that exchange on, I would say, respectable terms, going into the election, where they pretty much knew that John Adams was going to lose. And then it comes down to either Aaron Burr or Thomas Jefferson. And both Adamses believed that Jefferson deserved the presidency more than Aaron Burr, and thought he was much more qualified. And then Abigail and Thomas Jefferson have a flurry of letters in 1804, if I remember correctly. And they really kind of get on the topic of the split over politics. And Abigail writes that, she can deal with the difference in politics. What she couldn't forgive were the personal attacks. And Jefferson kind of doubles down, and Abigail is stubborn, and she just breaks off the correspondence. And John had also, during the presidency, he is not corresponding with Jefferson. He has a lot to say about Jefferson and his politics. But ultimately, John and Thomas Jefferson come back together and have a wonderfully rich correspondence that picks up in 1812 and really carries through for the rest of their lives. And so I don't know that Abigail was necessarily the cause, but Abigail definitely had her own opinions about Thomas Jefferson, and differed from her husband in that opinion.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of a similar note. Lisa Zankman Burke had kind of two-part questions. One is, did John and Abigail Adams have a very serious argument or disagreement over something? And she also wondered if they had the same opinion about Sam Adams.
Interesting. All right, I'm going to tackle the first one first. They did disagree. And serious, yes, I'm sure at times it was. I think, it's interesting to read the correspondence, and you can see when one or the other is slightly piqued. But they had kind of major philosophical disagreements about certain things. And one of the things that immediately comes to mind is kind of how they handled their money. And so John Adams always believed that investing in land and property was the best way to kind of increase wealth. Now, Abigail was a speculator. She wanted to invest in stocks and bonds as kind of a way to really have a return on that investment. And they did not agree on that, to the point that when they are in Europe, they are writing letters so Abigail's uncle, Cotton Tufts, is kind of managing their properties for them in their absence. And he's also the person that invests on Abigail's behalf, because of course women couldn't invest money of their own. They didn't really have their own money. And so he does it on her behalf. And so there's great exchanges of letters where John Adams writes to Cotton Tufts and says, okay, I'm sending you a bill of exchange. I want you to purchase this property. And then Abigail writes a letter saying, oh, I know he said that, but don't do that. And then Cotton Tufts writes back, and she's trying to get the letters before John gets that. I mean, it's just fabulous. And so it's not really you don't see anger necessarily, but it is definitely this fundamental disagreement that you see happen. She writes at one point, I wish he didn't love land so well. And so you kind of see that surfacing again and again over the course of their marriage. And I mean, really, by the time we hit the 1790s, Abigail does have a better handle on kind of managing their property and finances because she's been doing it for so long.
Mm-hmm. So we talked a lot about the politics between these two. Now we have a few questions that have to do with kind of going back to the start at their relationship. Robert Bergman asked, was it normal for men of John Adams' age to be courting girls as young as Abigail at the time? Today, that would obviously be seen as inappropriate, is what he said.
Yeah. So it's definitely different cultural norms. And actually for the 9 years that John and Abigail were different in age, her older sister Mary and Richard Cranch, there was actually a 16-year age difference. And so, I mean, 14 is young, and obviously they weren't courting at that point in time, but they are courting around the time that she's about 17. But it was a longer courtship, right? So she is 19, almost 20 when they get married. Um, and so you do see that kind of longer courtship with that, but it is not that unusual at that time.
Mhm. And so Linda Ryan from Naples, Florida asked, what was Abigail's life like raising the young family while her husband away? Did they have servants, nannies, any help? What was that home like life?
Yes. So they did have servants. So they had kind of domestic help. They might have had a cook at some point in time, and they definitely had younger women. A lot of times they were women from the neighborhood, essentially, who were coming in to help with housekeeping, essentially. But Abigail was responsible for a lot of the early education of their children. Um, in all, Abigail had 6 pregnancies, and she had 4 children who survived to adulthood. And that was so the first one was born in 1765, and the last one was born in 1777. And so was she spent most of the war caring for a young family, and certainly the early part of the war, where the locus of fighting is really in Boston and Massachusetts. She was taking care of young children in the situation, but she did have help.
Hmm. And so Kim Erskine asked, are there any letters that speak about their relationship and their children and, go into details about, the other members of the family?
Many. So many. And some of them are, Abigail, a lot of times it's just saying this is what's going on, like Tommy did this today and Johnny did that, and here's what little Nabby is doing. And John Adams is writing, from Philadelphia, saying, okay, don't neglect their education. And sometimes his letters are rather didactic, and it's like, you need to do this and this and this. And she's like, yeah, you're not here, I'm doing it. But I mean, that's right. Like they are always interested in their family and what their children are doing, and that even when their children are adults. And there's a lot of correspondence between parent and child, because the family was really spread out at different points in time, both, right? So John Adams is in Europe, sometimes with some of the children, right? So son John Quincy Adams went with his father to Europe twice, and Charles Adams, who was the third child, he and John Quincy Adams went to Europe. And then when John Quincy Adams entered his diplomatic career, his brother Thomas, who was the youngest of the surviving children, he accompanied his brother as his brother's secretary. And so there's all sorts of advice. Like Abigail writes some advice on who to court and who to marry, and didn't like one of the choices. And she's worried about her daughter, who is in New York for most of her married life, and married to someone who sort of never kind of found his good and true and hardworking place in the world, but was sort of a speculator and a dreamer, and that created some challenges for Nabby. And so they're both corresponding with their children, but also about their children.
Mhm.
Always.
Mhm. And so John Landrigan, he asked, to what extent do they have any expectation that the letters will be preserved or shared with others? Did they have any idea that these letters would not be private one day?
Yes. So the whole reason we have such an amazing corpus of family papers, there's this kind of moment of awareness that John Adams has. Well, he's at the Continental Congress in 1776, and he writes this letter to Abigail that he says, I've been writing letters for 20 years that I've been active in public life, and I haven't been keeping copies of them. And this is a disadvantage. And so from this point forward, I am going to keep a book and make a copy. And what he's talking about is a letter book, which is literally where someone, either he or a secretary, will copy out the letter before it gets sent. And so he's creating an archive. And he's doing that in part because he wants to refer back to things at times, right? He knows what he is participating in is significant, and the information that he's exchanging may be useful down the line. And it's really from that moment that you can see this idea of preserving the letters start to filter through their correspondence, right? So John Adams writes that letter in 1776. 2 years later, as John Quincy Adams is about to leave for Europe with his father, he writes Abigail a letter that says, my papa enjoins it upon me to keep a journal of the events that happened to me. And then thereafter, John Quincy Adams starts a diary that he keeps for nearly 70 years. And, John Adams writes his grandchildren, says, whatever you write, preserve. And so there really is this kind of family awareness that they want to protect and save their letters. What is really remarkable, I think, among the Adamses in creating this multi-generational archive is that they placed as much value on the letters, the personal letters that, say, the female members of the family wrote, or the private letters between them. And so it's not just recording the big events that they participated in that 20, 30, 40 years down the road they realized were major and significant. It's the letters, that Abigail writes to her daughter-in-law saying, hey, you're in town, can you get me chocolate and string, and I need some fabric, right? And so it's right, you get the small things and the big things, and it's why it's such an amazing archive to read, but also such a useful historical resource for a variety of people and the kinds of interests that kind of intersect with their correspondence.
So another interesting question from Ellen Peterson from Newton. She asked, how long would it take for a letter to arrive in either direction?
It depends when, and it depends where they are. And so once the kind of postal routes get up and running, so, say in the 1790s during the vice presidential years and the presidential years, most of the time a letter can get between Philadelphia and Boston in a handful of days. Sometimes it takes longer. Washington, D.C., it's then again a little bit longer, but it can depend on time of year, right? If the roads are muddy, the horses and the carriages have a harder time getting there. Letters to Europe, again, when there's, say, diplomatic packets and they're sending them by express ship, they go a little bit faster, right? We're talking about a number of weeks. When John Quincy Adams is in Russia and he's writing back to his parents and the rivers have frozen over, it can take months. And so you kind of get a sense of about how long it takes. But it's not even like today where you can say like, oh, I'm going to mail a letter to the West Coast and it'll be there. And,
Next up, from Heidi Zamzow, who is viewing from London, she asked, if Abigail did not have access to a formal education, how did she learn to read and write so well and have all the sophistication in her letters? Did she have tutors or family members who taught or mentored her?
Yes. So Abigail learned to read and write at home. Both her parents were involved in that, but also her grandmother. And then she further developed those skills kind of through reading and exchanging ideas with a network of correspondents. So young men and women that she exchanged letters with, they would, think about a book club, right? So I read John Locke, and they're explaining, ideas about whatever they're happening to be reading. And so you see them kind of exercising their intellect and building that. And then, as I said earlier, she really had some great mentors, right? Richard Cranch really encouraged her and her sister Mary to further develop their kind of knowledge. John Adams, of course, right? He's recommending things that she should read. They're having conversations about things that they're both reading, and the reading runs the gamut, right? And so Abigail loved her novels. She loved Shakespeare. She loved Addison and Pope. But she also read kind of Roman philosophers. And so it's broad. If you know anything about the Adamses, they collected a lot of books. And so there was a rich library at the family's home that John Adams had, and then John Quincy Adams. As they travel, they're sending books. There's this really charming letter that she writes when John Adams is, I think he's in Europe by this point. And she says, she's talking about the children and how the children are getting books as gifts, but the youngest, Tommy, is a little bit out of shape because he hasn't received a book. And at one point, John Adams asked, he's like, well, what kind of gift would they like? She's like, well, books. They expect books from you. And so it's just kind of reading and learning is part of the world. And so Abigail builds her intellect that way. And I mean, I think she was highly intelligent to begin with, but certainly, the home she was raised in, the fact that she was the daughter of the local minister, which meant their home was a meeting point for, right? So the kinds of political and intellectual conversations that happen with a local official, that are happening in her drawing room, and she can hear those. And then the same goes as she gets married and as her husband enters politics, that they are hosting a wide variety of people. She also lives in Europe for 4 years, right? And the access to, she is actually overwhelmed by the access to information that is available to her as a woman in Europe, right? And so she attends scientific lectures. She writes these wonderful letters to her nieces, explaining all the things she's doing and how she's learning. And I think she really relished kind of that period of living in Europe because of the kind of cultural doors it opened. And there's some really fabulous, she sends her nieces books and she says, I'm sending you a book on botany. And people may say that you really should focus on gardening, but I'm here to say that really you should build your intellects. And if people say that these aren't the kind of books that women should be reading, they're wrong. And you should read them anyway, because you should know about this, because you are going to be living an agrarian life. I mean, she doesn't use that word, but right. So they'll be living on a farm and they'll be the wives of kind of people pursuing agricultural pursuits. And therefore they should read and be more knowledgeable about these ideas than people may otherwise think.
Mm-hmm.
I think I got a little off topic there, but
no, it's all great, very interesting. Another question about Abigail that a lot of people are curious about is there any evidence that Abigail mentioned Phillis Wheatley, the writer, in any correspondence to either John Adams or anyone else?
I do not believe so. Not that I can think of, not from Abigail. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure from John either. Maybe some passing references. So Phillis Wheatley and George Washington corresponded, but I don't know that she was really in the Adamses universe.
So another question from Polixane Cobb from Cambridge. They wrote, one author I read said that Abigail was a slaveholder. I understood that her father held at least one person in bondage, but I was taught that John and Abigail were abolitionists, which is correct.
So the Adamses did not enslave people. Abigail did grow up in a household with enslaved people. So her father had up to 3 enslaved people. And I think the one that the audience member is referring to is Phoebe, who Phoebe was manumitted on her father's death. And essentially, he provided a stipend for her and then essentially entrusted her to the care of one of his daughters. And so she worked for the Adamses essentially for the rest of her life. And so when the Adamses are in Europe, she's living in one of their properties and taking care of the house. And as she ages and becomes more frail and unable to work, they take care of her. And so they didn't hold slaves themselves, and they both but Abigail did grow up in a household with it. And they weren't abolitionists. They were opposed to slavery, but they weren't kind of, I mean, abolitionism for John and Abigail isn't kind of as much of a thing then, but they were anti-slavery, and not abolitionists.
Mhm. So Nancy Barraclough asked, did the public or press ever criticize Abigail for her influence, or was it a kind of a secret?
So Abigail does engage with the press, and I think probably, I'm not sure that one was in the press actually. Most of the times that Abigail sometimes is corresponding with newspaper editors, kind of sending them information that she thinks they should publish. Um, can't think of too many criticisms of Abigail in the press. Certainly kind of her presence and her activities are noted in the press. She held during the presidential years, she held a weekly drawing room and kind of announcements about when that would be held. But I don't know that the attacks kind of that were made on the Adams family were made on Abigail, right? Like that was kind of a bridge too far. So they would attack John Adams and then later John Quincy Adams, but not the female members of the family.
Mm-hmm. So Christine Jacobs said that she heard that Mrs. Washington burned many of the letters with her husband. Do you know if that's true? And was it typical of couples for the era to destroy their letters, or was it more typical to save them the way the Adams did?
So it is true that Martha Washington destroyed many of the personal letters between herself and George Washington. Um, some women did. I mean, Abigail writes many times. She's like, you should burn this scribble, or my pen is often freer with my tongue. No one should see this. And she actually, there's some wonderful responses to that. I think one of my favorites from John is, you say burn your letters, but I would sooner die than burn your letters. But I think definitely she definitely writes of not wanting her correspondence seen. There, I don't remember exactly when. I think either at the end of the presidency or just after the presidency, a newspaper editor wants to print one of her letters. Like a newspaper editor in New York is that her daughter knows, wants to print something, and there's discussion about like publishing a letter. She's like, oh no, don't do that. And so I do sometimes wonder like what any of them would think about all of it being published, right? I mean, because some of it is really intimate and personal. And you do kind of wonder like if people would, how comfortable they would be. But despite the fact that she at times said that my letters should be destroyed, they were not.
Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, I know. Otherwise, we couldn't do
Not just
this.
professionally, right? Like I have a job because we have letters, but it's just
Exactly.
right, like such amazing. I mean, they were brilliant letter writers, first of all. But there's just so much valuable information about just everything that's going on in 18th and early 19th century society when you read Abigail Adams's letters.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of has to do with some of the personal details in those letters. Sally Craig Huber asked, the first letter shown talks about millions of kisses, and that appears to be written before their marriage. Was this surprising at the time?
Oh, that's a good one. So kind of the time Okay, the idea of kind of courtship and marriage is sort of shifting in the 18th century. And it's moving toward an idea of romantic love that is really kind of embodies kind of relationships in the 19th century. And so love letters aren't uncommon necessarily. And certainly there's research out there that shows like generally the male correspondents tend to be more effusive and female correspondents tend to be kind of a little more reticent to express their feelings, which we see in John and Abigail's letters. But sorry, I lost it. But I think in terms of like John is super playful, right? Like, and if you read like strings of his correspondence, there's a lot of humor in his writing. And I think you see that here. And I think teasing is frequently kind of a form of showing affection. And he's a little awkward. And I think that is how he expressed affection a lot of times. It resurfaces kind of across their marriage. It is incredibly painful. I mean, it's one of the more kind of, I mean, I haven't done extensive reading in lots of love letters across the board of the period, but it definitely is more effusive and humorous than I think some others that I have read.
Mm-hmm. And so Laura Zoll wanted to know, how did they keep their letters? Were they bundles tied in ribbon? Did they have a safekeeping place? How did they store these so that we were able to find them to this day?
Right. So they did bundle them. They kept them in trunks. Sometimes they put them in books. I mean, they talk about kind of carting their correspondence, or sometimes not having their correspondence because it would be maybe in Quincy as opposed to wherever they happen to be. It lived on their property in Quincy, so what is now Adams National Historical Park. All of those collected papers were in a wooden outbuilding for decades. And then John and Abigail's grandson built a stone library, and the correspondence was there for a number of years. But recognizing the value of it, that correspondence that they saved was actually placed here at the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1901. And so it's been in this building for 120 years or so.
Wow. And so Linda said that she was listening to a book that has interviews with historical authors, and she learned that there was during an 8-year period where Abigail was begging to him to tell her that he loved her, and he wouldn't because he thought there might have been a spy. Can you talk about if you've heard of anything like this, or are there any letters like this?
I'm trying to think about when this would be. So I'm assuming this is probably when he's in Europe. Okay, so let's deal with the spy aspect first of all. So during the revolution, there was a lot of concern about the interception of letters. And in fact, some of John's letters do get intercepted and published in the paper and cause all sorts of issues. And so a lot of times they're using code names. In order to just mask a little bit because they still need to exchange information. But this is part of why John is sometimes more circumspect than Abigail. He will write kind of maybe broad strokes of what's going on. He's like, and there's more, but really I would need to see you to tell you. And so there is this very real kind of threat of the interception of their correspondence. And that maintains for pretty much all of John Adams's public life. And it's true of other correspondence too. So like his son, when his son is serving at it as a diplomat, generally doesn't sign his letters. So he says, "Dear sir," and then he doesn't sign them in case they get intercepted, because it just makes it that much harder to identify who they are. In terms of her begging him to love him, is not really Abigail's character. She does definitely complain that he's not writing enough. She complains that, he's gone, right? She definitely writes about the sacrifice that she has made on her country's behalf because of her husband's public service. And when he's in Europe and she is starting to think about joining him, so they're waiting for Congress to call John Adams home, and Congress just isn't doing it. And she's like, should I come? Do you want me to come? Should I come? Okay, I'm going to come, even though I'm really scared to cross the ocean. And John kind of doesn't answer the question for a while, and she just makes the decision to go. And so she's like, all right, we're going to go. And then she and her daughter Nabby sail to Europe, and then she and John are together for about 4 years in Europe before they come home. So I think it's maybe a conflation of all of that.
Mhm. And so Bob from Westwood, Massachusetts wants to know, when he was in London, how long would it take for these letters to be received?
Again, it depends how they're traveling, but it could take several months. I mean, there are, and then you also don't necessarily know like how speedily John is writing. But there's definitely letters where Abigail's like, I haven't heard from you in 4 months. What's going on? But I think, reliably, it could take many weeks up to several months, depending on the time of year and the method of conveyance, right? So you could put things essentially in the mail that's traveling by ship. You could hand something to somebody to hand carry, because that is a much more secure way of transporting something, but it's less reliable in terms of timing, right? So if you send something with somebody who then goes to Philadelphia or forgets to give it to you, which sometimes happens, it can take longer.
Mhm. And so Robert Wong wanted to know about kind of two of these big topics going on at the time. Was there any correspondence about slavery going on, or any correspondence about how Abigail felt about how her husband defended, the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre? Was there any tension between, in these letters, any topic of that?
So I would say no to kind of the Boston Massacre story. I think Abigail generally kind of, I mean, she doesn't write about it, to be honest, but I would assume that she shared Adams's belief that everybody deserved a defense, which is why he defended the soldiers. In terms of writing about slavery, they do. There, and it's kind of pockets here and there. The kind of one of the early mentions that's really interesting is during the Continental Congress when they're drafting the Declaration, and it's very clear that Abigail has seen a draft in some capacity, and it was one of the earlier drafts that included language about slavery. And she makes this comment that says, I regret that some of the more manly sentiments had been struck out, right? And so we kind of interpret that to mean the phrasing they had in there, kind of eliminating slavery. And they talk about it. She talks about kind of this again during the Revolution. How committed can Virginia be to the cause of liberty and independence, right? That all the revolutionaries are fighting for. This is why we're fighting Britain. But how can they be committed to this when they don't necessarily recognize that within kind of everybody within Virginia, right? So how can people who enslave others are they true to fighting for the cause of liberty for Americans?
Mhm. So Crispy and several others wanted to know the biggest disagreement between the couple throughout these letters. I'd love to hear quickly about that, but also if you have a favorite moment in their letters, anything that you really wanted to recollect, I'd love to hear that.
Um, so I think, I mean, there are a couple, they disagree about lots of things. I think you can, many of their letters read like conversations. So I can't think of like major fights necessarily. And I think it's always nice to talk about the moments where they come together more. But I think like one of the really just amazing things about this correspondence, right? So it lasts 40 years. There's nearly 1,200 extant letters. And many of them really do read as conversations. And I think through it all is just this deep and abiding respect and love for one another. And no matter what you think about John Adams and Abigail Smith Adams, I promise you, if you read some of their letters, you're going to learn something new. Um, and more if there's a subject that you're interested in. I mean, they run the gamut. Abigail will write about agriculture and comment on fashion, and John writes about finances and property. And of course, there's more than a little politics thrown in. But there really is something for everyone in this correspondence, and so much of it is available online at the MHS, and we're working to publish more. Not we're through the period where we have John and Abigail's correspondence, but there are other letters. We're still working on that.
Yeah, this was so great to hear. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Sara, thank you so much for joining us. This was
Thank
an
you.
amazing conversation, and thank you to everyone for all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. There's so much to talk about on this topic, and if you are curious, we definitely encourage you to check out the Massachusetts Historical Society's website, learn more, read these letters. Sara, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks so much. Thank you everyone for joining us.